As dawn broke on July 1st, 1916, a low rumble echoed across the English Channel. For Londoners, it was a distant sound, easy to ignore. But in northern France, that rumble was thunder made by men, the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. What unfolded over the next 141 days would become one of the most catastrophic struggles in human history, a clash that left nearly 1 million dead or wounded. This is not just the story of a battle, but of ambition, sacrifice, and the cost of modern war. Welcome to the Somme. At dawn on July 1st, 1916, London lay quiet under a pale summer sky. Most of the city still slept, but in the silence of early morning, some residents stirred. Far in the distance, a low rumble echoed across the channel. To many, it was nothing unusual, just another unexplained noise in a restless, industrial city. They rolled over and drifted back into uneasy dreams. But that faint vibration carried with it a message of horror. What Londoners heard as a dull, distant boom was in truth the thunder of one of the greatest bombardments in human history. Thousands of British guns were tearing open the earth in northern France, hammering the German front line with millions of shells. The ground shook, the sky burned, and a storm of steel raged across the fields of the Somme. Within minutes, whistles would sound. British soldiers laden with packs and rifles would climb out of their trenches and march toward the enemy. For many, it would be the last sound they ever heard. That morning, the deadliest day in British military history began, not with a roar in London, but with a whisper from across the sea. By the end of 1915, the Great War had sunk into a nightmare of trenches. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, barbed wire and mud stretched for hundreds of miles. Millions of men lived like moles, buried in the earth, fighting and dying for mere yards of ground. Every attempt to break the deadlock had been met with machine guns, artillery barrages, and staggering losses. For the Allies, this was intolerable. France was bleeding. Russia struggled in the east. Italy was barely holding the line against Austria-Hungary. The Entente powers realized that unless something changed, Germany's superior coordination would crush them one front at a time. So, in secret councils, a bold plan emerged. In 1916, the Allies would strike, not in one place, but everywhere. The Russians would launch an eastern offensive, the Italians would hammer at the south, and in France, where British and French armies met, a joint assault would explode along the River Somme. The goal was simple, yet ambitious. Overwhelm the German war machine by stretching it to the breaking point. The Somme was chosen not because it mattered, but precisely because it didn't. Yet soon, it would become the most infamous killing ground of the First World War. The original Somme offensive was meant to be France's show of strength. With nearly 40 divisions prepared, the French army would strike hard, with Britain playing a supporting role. But fate intervened. In February 1916, Germany unleashed its own hammer blow. Verdun. For months, the Germans poured men and shells into that ancient fortress city, determined to bleed France white. Verdun became a furnace of death, swallowing French divisions whole. By summer, France had lost hundreds of thousands of men. Their armies were exhausted, stretched to the edge of collapse. The Grand Allied plan had to change. From the 39 French divisions once promised for the Somme, only 12 could now be spared. The rest were locked in the inferno of Verdun, desperately holding the line. Suddenly, the burden of the Somme shifted. Britain, still relatively fresh to the war, now found itself thrust into the spotlight. The inexperienced British army, swollen by volunteers, many barely trained, would carry the weight of the attack. What was once meant to be France's hammer strike had transformed into Britain's trial by fire. The Somme would no longer test just Germany. It would test the very soul of Britain's new army. In 1916, at the heart of Britain's war effort stood one man, General Sir Douglas Haig. Tall, stoic, and unshakably confident, Haig believed he had the answer to the stalemate. To him, victory at the Somme was not just possible, it was inevitable. His faith rested on one weapon: artillery. Haig was convinced that enough guns, firing enough shells, could tear the Germans out of their trenches. Weeks of bombardment would obliterate barbed wire, smash machine gun nests, and leave little more than shattered earth. Once the enemy was broken, British infantry would simply walk across no man's land and claim the ruins. It was a bold, almost mechanical vision of war, a battle won not by maneuver, but by mathematics. Haig believed he could calculate victory: the right weight of shells, the right length of bombardment, the right number of divisions. But beneath this confidence lay a deadly gamble. Many of Britain's shells were defective, much of the barbed wire was stronger than expected, and the Germans had dug their defenses deep, far deeper than Haig's guns could reach. Still, the orders were given. Britain would unleash fire like the world had never seen before. Haig believed he was about to break the deadlock forever. On June 24, 1916, the earth itself seemed to shudder. Along a 15-mile front, more than 1,400 British guns opened fire in unison. For 7 relentless days, they hurled nearly 2 million shells onto the German lines. Villages vanished into clouds of dust. Forests were ripped from the ground. The thunder could be heard as far away as London. To the soldiers waiting in the trenches, it felt like the apocalypse. Men cheered as shells screamed overhead, convinced that nothing could survive such destruction. Officers assured them, not even a rat will be alive on the German side. But what the British could not see was that much of their firepower was wasted. A third of the shells were duds, buried harmlessly in the mud. The barbed wire, thick, knotted, and deadly, remained intact in many places, and deep below ground, the Germans waited in bunkers of reinforced concrete, safe from the storm raging above. When the guns finally fell silent on the morning of July 1st, British soldiers climbed the parapets with confidence. They believed the enemy had been annihilated. In reality, the German army was alive, alert, and ready to kill. At 7:30 a.m., July 1st, 1916, the whistles blew. Across the British lines, tens of thousands of men climbed from their trenches and began to advance. They carried heavy packs, rifles at the ready, and the belief that the German defenses had been reduced to rubble. But within moments, that illusion was shattered. German machine guns, untouched in their deep bunkers, now opened fire. The chatter of MG-08s tore across no man's land, cutting down lines of men as if they were grass. Artillery shells exploded among the advancing waves, hurling bodies into the air. Entire battalions were erased within minutes. The PALS battalions, units made up of friends from the same towns, factories, and schools, were destroyed in a single morning. Communities back in Britain would never be the same. By nightfall, the cost was staggering. 57,000 British soldiers lay dead, wounded, or missing. Nearly 20,000 were killed outright. It was the single bloodiest day in British military history. The Somme had begun, not with triumph, but with catastrophe. What was supposed to be a breakthrough had instead become a massacre, and still, the battle was only in its first day. Amidst the carnage of July 1st, there were pockets of unexpected success. To the south of the battlefield, where the French army carried the weight of the assault, their meticulous artillery preparation tore gaping holes in the German lines. French troops surged forward, storming enemy trenches, capturing villages, and taking thousands of prisoners, with far fewer casualties than their allies. Even some British units, fighting on sectors where German defenses were weaker, managed to seize ground. South of the Albert-Bapaume road, divisions captured critical positions, proving that the strategy could work when firepower was concentrated effectively. For a moment, it seemed as though these breakthroughs might be expanded. Yet, the scale of the disaster in the northern sectors overshadowed these achievements. Where the British suffered annihilation, the French had demonstrated that the Germans were not invincible, that with precision, planning, and the right conditions, the front could indeed be broken. Though overshadowed by tragedy, these successes offered a glimmer of hope. The Allies had drawn blood, and the German army, while holding firm in many places, had not emerged unscathed. The Somme was not yet over, and the generals were determined to try again. In the days after July 1st, shock and grief rippled through the British High Command. Yet the offensive could not stop. The French were still locked in the nightmare of Verdun, and Haig knew Britain had to keep the pressure on. But this time, mistakes would not be repeated. For the next major assault, set for July 14th, the strategy changed. The objectives were smaller, the bombardment shorter but far more concentrated. Instead of spreading shells thinly across miles of front, the artillery would pound a narrow sector with relentless precision. Every German trench, every machine gun nest, every bunker would be smothered under fire. When the whistles blew just before dawn, British troops surged forward once more. But this time, the German defenses crumbled under the weight of firepower. Entire sections of the 2nd German defensive line fell into British hands. Losses were lighter, morale higher. For the first time in the Somme campaign, there was a sense of progress. It was not the decisive breakthrough Haig dreamed of, but it was proof that the British Army could learn, adapt, and strike back effectively. The Battle of the Somme was entering its next, deadlier phase. After the modest gains of July 14th, optimism flickered across the Allied lines. Yet what followed was not a breakthrough, but a slow descent into grinding attrition. From mid-July to September, the Somme became a battlefield of endless, bloody skirmishes, later remembered as the forgotten battles. At places like Highwood, Delville Wood, and Guillemont, British, French, and Dominion troops hurled themselves against fortified German positions. Each attack was met with furious counterattacks. Villages were reduced to rubble, forests splintered into wastelands of shattered trunks and corpses. Australian divisions, newly arrived from Gallipoli, suffered horrifying losses at Pozières. In just 6 weeks, nearly as many Australians were killed there as during the entire Dardanelles campaign. South Africans bled at Delville Wood, clinging to their positions until nearly annihilated. Every gain was measured not in miles, but in yards. The front lines shifted, but never decisively. The Germans, though strained, fought like cornered beasts, and the British, though learning, lacked the strength to break them. By September, the battlefield had become a charnel house of mud, fire, and shattered men. Yet Haig was not finished. He had a new weapon, one that promised to change the war forever. By September 1916, the Somme had already consumed tens of thousands of lives. Haig knew that only something extraordinary could break the deadlock. His gamble? A secret weapon. Still crude, still experimental. The tank. On September 15th, 49 machines were meant to take the field. Barely 18 made it to the front. They were slow, unreliable, and often broke down before firing a shot. Yet when they worked, they terrified the Germans. Steel monsters rolled across no man's land, crushing barbed wire, spraying bullets, and shielding advancing infantry. One sector saw a stunning advance of nearly 2 miles, the greatest British gain of the entire campaign. But the promise of the tank came too early. Most ground to a halt within hours. Without mass numbers, there could be no true breakthrough. The fighting dragged on into October and November, through rain, mud, and exhaustion. When the battle finally ended on November 18th, the Allies had advanced just 7 miles. The cost? Over 1 million casualties on all sides. The Somme became a symbol of futility, a byword for slaughter. Yet historians remind us it bled the German army white, forced them back to the Hindenburg Line, and set the stage for ultimate Allied victory. By the time the guns finally fell silent on November 18, 1916, the Somme had claimed more than 1 million lives. The Allies advanced barely 7 miles, and the land they gained was measured in mud, blood, and shattered lives. Yet the battle forced Germany to bleed, to retreat, and to gamble on desperate measures that would ultimately seal its fate. For Britain and France, the Somme was not victory, but survival, bought at a terrible price. It stands today as both a warning and a testament: the courage of ordinary men and the tragic cost of modern war.